Welcome back to another exciting episode of our COP29 podcast series, where we bring together global experts to discuss the most pressing issues on climate change, sustainability, and innovation. This podcast is proudly presented in collaboration with Michigan State University and Impact Azerbaijan. I am your host, Gulnara, in this episode. Today, we are thrilled to welcome our guest from Michigan State University, Dr. Laura Schmidt-Olabisi. Dr. Schmidt-Olabisi is an associate professor in the Department of Community Sustainability and the Environmental Science and Policy program at Michigan State University. As a participatory system modeler, she collaborates directly with stakeholders to build models that promote adaptive learning about the dynamics of coupled human-natural systems while integrating stakeholder insight with academic expertise. Her extensive work spans communities in Southeast Asia, West Africa, and the United States, addressing critical issues in agriculture, food, and natural resource management. She currently serves as a president-elect of the United States Society for Ecological Economics. In today's episode, we will dive into climate science and research, exploring the latest findings from MSU's climate research and discussing their implication for global climate policy. Let's get started. Good morning, Laura.
Good morning, good afternoon from Ibadan, Nigeria, where I currently am. It's afternoon here, so good to talk to you.
Can you highlight some of the most impactful recent findings from MSU's climate research?
Gosh, well, MSU, the climate research at MSU is so broad, and there's so many people working on this very important issue. I mean, we have, a couple of thousand faculty at MSU, and a good portion of them are doing work on climate change. Everything from how it impacts agricultural products in Michigan to, some of the work I do, which is focused both on Michigan, but also on the global South and on West Africa and West African agriculture. To how water resources in Michigan are impacted by climate change, basically every aspect. And that's one of the things I love about Michigan State is that we have this diverse expertise and research that really spans a wide range of topics.
How do these findings enhance our insights into climate change and its impact on both natural ecosystems and human communities?
Well, so the main science of climate change has been well established for decades now, right? That the Earth is warming, that weather patterns are shifting, and that this is caused by human activity, mainly fossil fuel burning and also land use change. So that's well established. However, a lot of the science that is currently ongoing and that is very important in the climate arena concerns things like how can we adapt human and environmental systems to climate change while supporting ecosystem functioning and human well-being. So there's a lot of adaptation research going on. There's a lot of research on mitigation options and how we can choose between different options that might help to reduce our greenhouse gas impact. And there's a number of very well laid out pathways that scientists have already laid out about how this could be done, right? How to get the world back under 1.5 degrees C of warming, where we need to be. And then there's also a lot of work on the impacts of climate change on diverse communities and vulnerable communities, both in the US and globally. So we know that climate change is going to impact the most vulnerable people hardest, right? Those that are already poor, predominantly women, predominantly people in the global South. So there's a lot of research looking at that and looking at how climate adaptation and climate mitigation could be more equitable and make sure that we really take care of those who are most vulnerable in whatever solutions we come up with. So I'd say those are kind of like the main avenues of climate research now. And of course, there's still work going on to better quantify how the Earth is responding to climate change and looking at how warming is affecting climate systems generally. That's also, of course, ongoing.
How do you anticipate these research findings will shape international climate policies and influence decision-making process?
Well, it's funny you ask me that as a scientist, because I have been working in climate science for, oh gosh, almost 30 years, ever since I was an undergraduate. And one of the things that when I get together with my fellow scientists working on climate, one of our main frustrations is, why isn't policy implementing the science, right? And I think the answer to that, it's complex, but I think that the answers to that lie more on the policy side, right? And more on the governance side, and more on the social change side. Um, so it is my hope, always, as it has been for 30 years, that policymakers take the science of climate change much more seriously and take it as the emergency that it is. And we see some of that, but in my view, not nearly enough.
How is this MSU applying a cross-disciplinary approach to address multi-faced challenges of climate science?
Hmm. Yeah, I think that personally, I think that MSU does interdisciplinary research really well. I think better than a lot of institutions. So every single project that I've been involved on since I've been at MSU for 16 years now has really been highly interdisciplinary. It's involved natural scientists, physical scientists, social scientists, sometimes folks from the humanities, uh, working with folks in communities, so even transdisciplinary, right, outside of the boundaries of the university. And that's really the way that climate science has to be, because we have to be looking at solutions that are going to be implemented by decision makers and communities. So we have to involve them. And then we also have to be looking at the impacts on natural systems, on environment, on people, across many different dimensions. So climate science is inherently interdisciplinary. And yeah, I think MSU does that really well.
You already touched the topics that like how does stakeholder input shape your research projects, and what benefits does this bring to the policy making process?
Yeah, so I am a participatory researcher. So pretty much all of my projects involve stakeholder input, involve community input, involve input from policymakers, from decision makers, from community leaders. So that's very important because, again, the people who are going to live with the solutions, who are going to implement the solutions, who are going to do the actual work of climate adaptation or mitigation are going to be those people, right? They're not going to be us scientists. We can advise, we can bring our expertise, but they're the ones that are going to have to do it. So in order for those solutions to be acceptable, to be equitable, to be things that people actually implement, they really have to have a say in what we do, right? So we have to construct the research and the solutions together. And so that's the approach that I usually take. And so one example of that is that I'm working on a project here in Nigeria in 4 different Sahelian countries. So northern Nigeria, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali. And we're looking at how climate change is impacting soil fertility and how those two things kind of go together. And so we're doing some scientific modeling, but we're also consulting with communities on the ground and figuring out what they're already doing to address these problems of soil fertility and climate. What's working, what's not working, what are their concerns, so that we can really co-design solutions with them. Because if it's not something the community wants, needs, or accepts, it's just not going to be feasible, right? So we just kind of did a first round of consultation with them. And it's really kind of remarkable that they're already doing things on the ground. They're already organizing themselves to combat the effects of climate change. And so how can their efforts be strengthened and scaled up and supported is one of the things we can talk about with this project.
With the rapid evolution of climate science, how does Michigan State University ensure its research remains current and influential?
It's vital to have funding for this research, right? You know, federal scientific funding is one of the things that makes Michigan State one of the best research universities in the world. It's one of the things that makes the United States the most highly sought after destination for people who want to study and do research. People come from all over the world to study and do research at our universities because they are funded through federal grant dollars. And so this money helps us find solutions that help people around the world, including, I've worked in West Africa, like I mentioned, but I've also worked in Flint. I just put in a research proposal to work in Detroit and look at climate and how it influences flooding in Detroit, together with community partners there. So we do work that benefits folks in our own backyard as well as across the world. And that's what Michigan State is really good at, what we're great at. So that work needs to be supported if that science is going to continue to go forward. And I think, people don't always see the process behind the scenes. They see the benefits of it when it comes out, and they might not know that that's only because of these federal research dollars that work can continue and benefit everybody. So.
Could you share some example of major partnership or collaborations that have been instrumental in advancing your climate research?
Yeah, so I already mentioned a couple. Like I said, I just put in a proposal to look at how climate change is influencing flooding in Detroit. So flooding is a major concern in Detroit. You may have seen in the news that there's been increased flooding events over the last few years. It's impacting a lot of lower income residents of the city. So I just wrote a proposal together with community partners in Detroit, including folks, from the city, representing the city, folks representing different nonprofits in the city, to look at how homeowners and folks, maybe schools and churches could actually implement things on their property that would help to be climate adaptive and reduce funding, right? Reduce flooding, rather. So that's an example of like working with collaborators, and we wrote the proposal together. We came up with the idea together. Something that was important to Detroiters and something that is scientifically interesting, together. So that's just one example. I've also worked on a project in Flint that concluded last year or the year before, that was looking at the food system and how the food system could be more equitable and sustainable. And that heavily involved local partners, including the Community Foundation for Greater Flint, right? So yeah, a lot of folks at MSU, not just me, but a lot of folks at MSU work with external partners in their research. It's a great environment to be able to do that.
I'm very interested about like, do you have any follow up after your research, like how they use their research in their daily work or maybe policy shaping?
Yeah, we always try to follow up, and we also know that sometimes things take time to change, right? Sometimes you can learn
Yeah,
something and then it takes you
exactly.
some time to implement. But one example is that for the Flint project, just as we were concluding the project, the Food Policy Council of Flint and Genesee County was forming. And so they took the research that we did on board and used that to develop some of their planning for the Food Policy Council. So directly taking the research and thinking about how do we implement this and make the food system in Flint better. So that was a really rewarding project because you could see directly, okay, the science to actual implementation and policy making happen. We also held a bunch of community dialogues with folks involved in the food system where they came in and kind of talked to us about how they were going to implement the findings in their own work. So that was really cool.
What emerging trends in climate science do you believe will be critical for shaping future global climate policies?
Well, there was a lot of discussion, and so in the most recent COP in Baku, Azerbaijan, there was a lot of discussion, and there is a lot of discussion in the climate space generally about ethics and equity in climate, right? So we're facing a fundamental reality that, as I mentioned before, climate change is going to harm the most vulnerable the most, and yet they're the least responsible for the climate change that we see happening, right? It's primarily wealthy countries like the US, Europe, Canada, et cetera, that have put the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that are causing climate change currently, because they stay there for, carbon dioxide stays there for about 200 years, right? So basically, the United States' industrial revolution that made it a wealthy country is what's currently causing problems for countries that are not wealthy now. So there's a fundamental unfairness to that. There's a fundamental ethics question to that. And so part of the discussion at the most recent COP was about how do more wealthy countries set up a mechanism to compensate less wealthy countries for damages that they sustain because of climate change, but also to give them some funding so that they can develop using renewable energy, so they can develop in a way that's not going to contribute to climate change. So I think that's going to be a lot of the discussion over the next few years. I think we're going to be seeing, frankly, some courts, we're already seeing some court cases, right, where some countries or some groups of people are trying to sue, oil companies, for example, for damages caused by climate change. And it'll be interesting to see how that plays out and what the consensus around international law is going to be. So folks who study law, that's going to be a big frontier. But yeah, I think thinking about how to make climate adaptation and mitigation equitable and really use it to uplift human well-being is going to be a big topic of concern.
How can academic research most effectively guide and support the development of sustainable and adaptive climate policies?
Yeah, I mean, I think science is absolutely vital to the creation of these policies. It's a vital component, and it's not the only component, right? Um, so I think that it is moving in the right direction, and that more and more scientists are working hand in hand with communities and policymakers to try to make sure that the research is relevant and that it is linked to decision-making processes. I see more scientists doing that, which is great. Um, Trying to communicate science in a way that's relevant, in a way that people can hear, in a way that's accessible is also important. There's some great science communicators out there who do that very, very well. Um, but yeah, I think, as we go forward and start to implement these solutions, the science is already there. And frankly, I think the science has been leading the policy in this arena for a long time. And I think it's going to continue to support. Again, if you talk to any climate scientists, I think what they would say is we wish that policymakers would listen more to us, right? So, yeah.
You mentioned about COP29. Like, what is your main takeaway from COP29, Baku?
This was a convening of, I don't know what the final number was, maybe 50,000 people or so, tens of thousands of people who were very concerned about climate change. And sure, some of them may be greenwashing, some of them may be pretending to care, but a lot of people who genuinely care. The people from the private sector, from the government sector, people from NGOs, representatives of indigenous communities, you name it, like everybody was there. And having conversations about what they're doing to combat climate change, what they're doing to adapt to climate change, innovative solutions, ideas. So I feel like there was so much energy at that level as well, especially at the local, maybe the subnational level, around sharing solutions, sharing ideas, sharing collaboration to deal with this crisis. That gave me more hope than I would have had just listening to the top level leaders, right? Because it's not only up to them. Like, sure, they have an important role to play and they need to be doing their jobs, but there's also a lot going on at lower levels of governance. Cities, like mayors of cities, can have a huge impact on the climate resilience and climate footprint of their cities. Implementing things like green infrastructure and public transportation and clean energy and building codes. I mean, there's so much that can be done by mayors, right? And is being done by mayors around the world. So it was really cool to hear some of those examples as well. And that's what gave me a bit more hope and kind of, the headlines were a lot about the top level, but a lot of these stories kind of went under the radar.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you so much.
Thank you.